She was never part of the plan. He said it without pausing. Standing at the far end of a dining room she'd never been invited into before tonight, surrounded by men who spoke in low voices and wore the kind of calm that came from never needing to raise them. Quentin Whitfield looked at his older brother across a table set for 12 and said the words like they were a simple fact he'd already filed away. The hallway was cold. Delaney had been looking for a bathroom. She hadn't known the East Wing even existed until the housekeeper gestured vaguely in this direction, and she'd followed the corridor until she heard Quentin's voice through a door left open by an inch, and then she'd stopped. She was 31 years old. She owned a small café called Groundwork on the north side of Chicago, the kind of place with exposed brick and handwritten chalkboard specials and regulars who left their laptops open all afternoon. She had no idea how to exist in a house like this. She had known that coming in. She'd told herself it didn't matter, that Quentin had never made her feel it mattered, that 5 months of Saturday mornings and long walks along the lake and conversations that went until 2 in the morning meant something more durable than a house. Roland's voice before Quentin's, "You've been bringing her around long enough," fathers noticed. "That's not discretion, it's a pattern." Then silence, the particular quality of a room where men were waiting for another man to fall in line. Then Quentin, she was never part of the plan. Delaney stood in the hallway with her hand flat against the wall and listened to a sentence she knew, even at that moment, she would carry for the rest of her life. She had been carrying something else for 2 weeks. She just didn't know it yet. She waited until the conversation moved on. Something about a port contract, a name she didn't recognize, and then she turned around and walked back the way she'd come. Past the portraits, past the sitting room where she'd left her coat folded over the arm of a settee, like a guest who expected to return. She picked up her coat. She picked up her bag. At the entry table near the door, she stopped. She'd brought something tonight, wrapped in the brown paper she used for bakery orders, tied with kitchen twine because she hadn't had ribbon. Inside was a ceramic mug she'd made in a pottery class 8 weeks ago, the only piece she'd ever finished, uneven at the base, glaze that had come out deeper blue than she'd planned. Quinton had mentioned once, standing in her kitchen at 7 in the morning while she made espresso, that he'd never seen the point of owning nice things just for himself, that he drank coffee from paper cups in his office. She'd thought about that for weeks before she made the mug. She thought about it differently now. She set it back on the table, still wrapped. She did not leave a note. The car she'd taken here was waiting on the street. She got in and gave the driver her address. She kept her hands in her lap and looked out at the city doing its November thing, the lake somewhere to her right, invisible but present, the way it always was in Chicago, whether you were looking at it or not. She didn't cry until she was inside her apartment, door locked, shoes off, standing in the kitchen with the lights not yet on. Then she cried quickly and completely and stopped, the way she'd learned from a mother who believed grief had a time limit, not because it did, but because you had to keep moving anyway. She was still standing in the dark kitchen when she remembered the 2 missed periods she'd been explaining away as stress. The clinic was on Belmont. She'd been going there since she was 24, back when her regular doctor didn't take her insurance, and then she'd just stayed because Dr. Pelletier was practical and unhurried and said difficult things in a tone that made them feel survivable. Delaney had come in thinking she was burned out. 5 months of a relationship that had lit up parts of her she'd forgotten existed, layered on top of 60-hour work weeks and a lease renewal that had nearly killed her. She thought she was just depleted. Dr. Pelletier came in with the tablet and said, "Before anything else, I want to do a quick imaging scan. The initial result is a little interesting." Interesting. 2 shapes, 2 heartbeats, each one a small, bright certainty on the screen, filling the exam room with a sound she hadn't been prepared for. "Twins," Dr. Pelletier said, "around 8 weeks. Both appear healthy. Do you have any questions?" Delaney looked at the screen for a long time. "No," she said, "not yet." She had 42 missed calls from Quinton by the following Thursday. She counted them the way she counted inventory, precisely without feeling, just data. She read none of the texts. She listened to none of the voicemails. She put the phone face down behind the espresso machine and pulled shots and greeted regulars and chalked the day's specials in her worst handwriting because her hands weren't entirely steady, and she didn't have the patience to redo it. She called her best friend Amani at 11 on a Wednesday night. Without a greeting, "I'm pregnant." Silence. How far? 8 weeks. Is it? Yes. Another silence. Amani had known Quinton's name before she'd known anything else about him, because Delaney had said it once at dinner in June with a look on her face that Amani had catalogued and filed away. She'd met him in September and said afterward privately, "He compartmentalizes, something in how he holds his shoulders when his phone rings, like he's deciding in real time who he has to be." Delaney had said she was reading into things. Imani had said maybe. "What do you want to do?" Imani asked now. "Keep them." Delaney hadn't known she'd already decided until she heard herself say it. Both of them. "Okay, no hesitation, then that's what we do." "I'm not telling him." A pause, longer this time. "I know what you're going to say," Delaney started. "I'm going to say," Imani said quietly, "that a man who calls you never part of the plan in front of his brother and a room full of people you'd never even been introduced to doesn't automatically get to vote on what happens next. But I'm also going to say that you're going to have to figure out what you actually believe is right. And those two things can both be true at the same time." Delaney sat on the floor of her apartment. She'd been on the floor for an hour, leaning against the couch, because the couch felt too far from the ground tonight. She put her hand on her stomach. Nothing to feel yet. Just the knowing. "I need time," she said. "I know, but eat something that isn't espresso." Quentin Whitfield stopped sleeping. Not completely. He could get a few hours of something shallow around 4 in the morning, the kind that left him more exhausted than if he'd stayed awake. But the real kind, the deep kind that came when your conscience wasn't grinding against something unresolved, was gone. He had made a calculation in that dining room. Roland had laid out the terms before Delaney arrived. End it, publicly and cleanly, or Roland would handle it his own way. Roland's way involved a word, efficient, that Quinton had learned long ago to translate as ruthless. The Whitfield organization had been ruthless in its efficiency for 3 decades. Quinton had grown up inside it. He had also spent 12 years building a legitimate investment firm alongside it, because he had always told himself that the two could remain separate. He had said what he was required to say. He had believed, standing in that room, that cruelty stated publicly would put permanent distance between Delaney and what his family was capable of. He had not accounted for her hearing him. He found out 4 days later. A member of the household staff mentioned offhand that a package had been left in the entry, still on the table, uncollected. He drove to the house himself. He unwrapped it, standing in the foyer. A ceramic mug, handmade, glazed a deep, uneven blue, the base slightly off-center in the way of something made by a person still learning. He turned it over in his hands. He remembered standing in her kitchen in October, watching her make espresso with the focus she brought to everything, and saying something careless about paper cups. She'd laughed and said that was sad. He'd agreed. He hadn't known she'd been listening beyond the laugh. There was no note. He called her 6 times that night. He texted. He wrote an email at 1 in the morning that he deleted and rewrote and sent and watched go unanswered for 4 days. He had a letter hand-delivered the following week. 3 pages, the kind he'd never written to anyone, that said things he had never said out loud. He tracked the courier confirmation and waited. Nothing came back. Delaney Bennett had walked out of his life as quietly and precisely as she'd come into it, and she'd left behind something that cost more than it should have, and he understood, standing in the foyer with the mug still in his hand, that he had done something that could not be easily undone. He didn't know yet how much worse it was than that. Cyrus had been Quinton's head of security for 9 years. He was 51, and his face had stopped being expressive around the time he'd stopped finding things surprising. He showed up at Quinton's apartment on a Tuesday morning without being asked, sat at the kitchen island, poured himself coffee, and did not comment on the ceramic mug sitting on the counter, the blue one, the uneven one, which had not moved in 3 weeks. "You look terrible," Cyrus said. "Thank you. I've had eyes on her café since last week." Quinton looked up. "You didn't ask me to." Cyrus wrapped both hands around the mug. "I did it because you were about to, and I wanted to skip the part where you pretend you weren't going to. She opens at 6. She's there until close most nights. Her friend Imani comes by Tuesdays and Fridays. She's not seeing anyone." He paused. "She looks tired." Tired landed somewhere specific. "She's not responding to anything I've sent." "I know." Cyrus was quiet for a moment. "What do you need her to understand? Because in my experience, the explanation doesn't change what was heard. It adds more words to the same wound." Quinton looked at the mug. "She left this. Spent real time making it. Didn't leave a note. Didn't come back for it. Didn't call me to yell. She just left." He looked at Cyrus. "She had one leaving in her, and she used it." Cyrus nodded slowly. "Some people do." "Get me a real meeting," Quinton said. "Neutral. Not here. Not the house. Somewhere she'd agree to. She mentioned a place near the river once." "She has to agree first." "I know. I'll wait until she does." Cyrus gave him the kind of look that held things it wasn't going to say out loud. Then, "And Roland?" "Roland got what he asked for," Quinton said. "He doesn't get anything else from me right now." What Quinton didn't know, what Cyrus didn't know, was that the calls and the letter and the emails Quinton believed were being received and ignored were not in fact reaching Delaney the way he imagined. Roland had seen to that. He was 45 years old and had been running the operational side of the Whitfield organization since their father's health had declined. He was careful and methodical and had spent 2 decades ensuring that whatever needed to stay invisible stayed invisible. He had noticed what Delaney was to Quinton before Quinton had finished noticing it himself, and he had decided early that a clean separation was the simplest outcome. The voicemails Quinton left, 3 in the first week, increasingly unlike the controlled man who'd spoken in the dining room, were archived on a server Delaney had no way of knowing existed. Emails were quietly rerouted. The handwritten letter was never delivered to her address. It went to a P.O., box she'd vacated 18 months ago, before she moved into the apartment above her cafe. Roland told their father the situation was managed. Their father nodded and moved on to other business. Quinton waited for a response that was never going to come. Cyrus was the one who finally got him a thread. He ran into Imani at a coffee shop near Groundwork, the café Delaney owned, which had become in 3 weeks a name Cyrus knew as well as any address in the city. He sat down across from her without preamble, and she looked at him the way someone looked at a representative of the thing they were protecting someone from. "She's not calling him back," Imani said before he could speak. "I know." "Then what do you want?" "To know if she's all right." Imani studied him. "She's managing, which isn't the same thing." "No, it's not." Cyrus wrapped his hands around his cup. "He needs her to know," he said, "that what happened, what he said, wasn't the full picture." He called her never part of the plan. Imani's voice didn't rise, which somehow made it worse, in front of his brother and whoever else was in that room. And then he had a letter delivered to an address she moved out of a 1.5 years ago, which means either someone on his side didn't check or someone on his side made sure it didn't arrive. Cyrus went still. Imani watched his face. "I see you registering that." "Say that again." "The letter. It went to her old address on Clark Street. She moved to the apartment above the cafe 18 months ago. Quinton knew the current address. She gave it to him in July. So either the courier made a mistake—" "He didn't make a mistake," Cyrus said. His voice had gone flat in a specific way. Imani looked at him steadily. "I didn't think so." Cyrus was quiet. "Does she know?" "She knows the letter went somewhere wrong. She hasn't thought through why yet. Has she read it? No. Cyrus nodded once. I need to make a call. I figured. But before you do, Amani held his gaze. She's not just managing a broken heart. She paused, choosing the next sentence carefully. She's building something. Whatever Quentin is doing to fix this, it needs to be because he actually understands what he did, not because he wants something back. Because she is building a life right now, and whatever comes through her door has to be worth the disruption. She left before he could ask the follow-up question that was already forming behind his eyes. The routing records went on Quinton's desk at 8 the following Wednesday morning. The letter had been sent correctly, Delaney's current address, exactly as Quinton had written it. Somewhere between dispatch and arrival, the destination had been changed through an internal account in the Whitfield building's communications system. The account belonged to Roland. Quinton read the printout once. He set it face down and put both hands flat on the desk. How many? 3 voicemails, the letter, at least 2 emails. Cyrus sat across from him. There may be more. We're still pulling records. Under Roland's direction? Almost certainly. Quentin looked at the far wall of his office. It was a clean room that had taken him 15 years to earn in a way he'd never examined too closely. He had always told himself the legitimate and the criminal were separate halves of what his family had built. He had always known, at some level, that they weren't. His father had woven them together from the beginning. Roland had maintained the weave, and Quentin had moved through both because he hadn't found the will to stop. He looked at the printout. Set up a meeting, he said. Neutral. Not here, not the house. She mentioned a place on the river once, somewhere with a view. I'll reach out to the friend. And get the letter back. It's at an address on Clark. Go yourself. He paused. There's something else. Cyrus's voice changed register slightly. A man in our IT infrastructure named Wells has a secondary arrangement with Roland that predates the dinner. He's been feeding Roland a file. Delaney's schedule, her routines, her medical appointments. Quinton looked up. Roland was building a dossier on her before the dinner happened. He saw what she was to you before you'd finished seeing it yourself. He paused, and Wells knew about the pregnancy before you did. The office was very quiet. He knew there were children, Quinton said, and he still sent that document. Yes. Cyrus said nothing else. Outside, 40 floors down, Chicago did what cities did, indifferent, continuous. And Quinton sat with the shape of the last 5 months rearranging itself into something significantly worse than a broken relationship. She may not respond even then, Cyrus said finally. I know. There's one more thing. He looked at Quinton directly. The friend said she's building something. Not rebuilding. Building. He let that sit for a moment. I've been thinking about that word. Quinton's hands went still. Is she pregnant, he said? It was not a question. Cyrus said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The meeting happened 11 days later, at a restaurant that sat on the Chicago River with floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the water gray-green in November light. Imani came with Delaney. Cyrus was at a table near the door. Quinton was already there when Delaney arrived. He'd chosen a corner table, quieter than he needed to, smaller than his usual instinct toward defensible space. She noticed that. He stood when she came in. He always had. She sat across from him without speaking. Amani sat beside her. The silence lasted long enough that the waiter appeared and disappeared without taking an order. Thank you for coming, Quinton said. I'm here for information, Delaney said, not because anything has changed. I know. Then say what you need to say. He said all of it. He started with the dining room, what Roland had told him before she arrived, the specific and detailed threat laid out plainly about what would happen to anyone Quinton kept close who wasn't already inside the organization's protection. He described the calculation he'd made in that moment, that cruelty stated publicly would read as finality and remove her from the threat radius permanently. He described the weeks afterward, the calls, the texts, the letter, the courier. Then he put the routing records on the table. Delaney picked them up. She read them the way she read everything, completely and without hurrying, her face doing the careful neutral thing it did when she needed to finish receiving before she started responding. "Your brother," she said. "Yes. Under your father's direction." "Almost certainly." She set the document down. She looked out at the river, at the gray-green water moving steadily under the bridge. She was quiet long enough that Amani put one hand lightly on the table beside her, not touching, just present. "So every time I decided not to call you back," Delaney said, "every time I told myself you'd made your choice and I was making mine, you were actually trying to reach me, and Roland was making sure I never knew that." "For 5 months, yes." She looked at him. "And you expect me to do what with that?" "Nothing. I needed you to have the complete picture. What you do with it is entirely yours." A boat moved on the river outside, slow and purposeful, trailing a long white wake behind it. "I'm pregnant," Delaney said. "Twins." "I know." "How long have you known?" "A week." She nodded once, the nod of someone filing information rather than reacting to it. "What do you want?" He looked at her directly. "I want to be in their lives. I want to earn that right. I'm not asking you to come back to where we were. I'm not asking you to forgive anything on a timeline. I'm asking for the chance to show you that the person you thought you saw when we were together was real, not a performance, not the organization, him." Delaney looked at the records on the table. She looked at her hands. "I need to think." "I know." "It's not a yes." "I know." "But it's not a no," Imani said quietly. Delaney looked at her. Imani looked back with the expression she used when she was letting a point stand without arguing for it. Delaney decided not to fight it. They stayed another 30 minutes. The conversation moved into smaller territory, not warm, but not hostile. The careful navigation of two people trying to locate any ground between them that was still solid. When they left, Quinton walked her to the car she'd arranged herself. He stopped on the sidewalk without reaching for her and said, "Whatever the twins need medically, I'd like to be responsible for that, regardless of everything else. I'll think about it." He started to say something else. She stopped him with the smallest motion of her hand. "Not now." But she looked at him steadily, the way she looked at things she needed to be absolutely clear about. "If I let you in, if I decide to let you anywhere near them, and you choose that world over them, even once," she held his eyes, "I will take them somewhere so far from the Whitfield name that your lawyers will spend a decade catching up. Do you understand that?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. She got in the car. Roland went to her building 4 days later. Cyrus called at 6:15 in the morning. The register in his voice, flat, deliberate, stripped of everything that wasn't the information itself, told Quinton it was bad before the words did. He got past the front door. Her neighbor let him in, didn't know who he was. He was in the hallway outside her apartment for approximately 12 minutes before Imani arrived and called it in. He knocked. Delaney didn't answer. He slid something under the door and left. Did he touch her? No. What was under the door? A pause, a legal document, settlement offer in the 8-figure range, structured as full and permanent termination of parental rights for both children, irrevocable. The family's attorneys drafted it. There's a handwritten note from Roland at the bottom. It says, "Cyrus stopped briefly. This is the cleanest outcome for everyone involved, including them." Quinton stood in his bedroom while the city outside was still mostly dark, and he listened to each word replace the previous one before the next one arrived. 8 figures, terminate parental rights, both children, permanent and irrevocable. His brother had gone to her building, had stood in her hallway while she was pregnant and alone, and had slid a document under her door asking her to legally erase his children from the family that had sent him there. Where is she now? Imani's apartment. She's safe. Cyrus paused. She called Imani at midnight. She'd been sitting with it alone for 6 hours first. 6 hours alone. "I need to see her today." "She's not ready." Imani said, "Give her until tomorrow." And Roland? He went back to the house. Quinton looked at the window. The early gray of Chicago before dawn, the skyline still deciding what kind of day it was going to be. He had spent 5 months believing the damage was a private thing. A relationship broken, a woman he had hurt, a mistake that was his alone to correct if she would let him. He had spent 1 week thinking the future was navigable. Roland had just slid a document under her door at midnight. This was not sentiment being managed. This was the family's infrastructure moving against the woman carrying his children. And Quinton stood in his bedroom with that fact and understood, for the first time with complete clarity, what the next decision was going to cost and why it was the only decision available. He drove to the Whitfield house before the sun cleared the skyline. His father was in the study. Roland was at the breakfast table. They had the look of people who had arranged themselves for a conversation they'd expected, and Quentin looked at both of them from the doorway and understood that every second of this interaction had been pre-staged. He walked in. He picked up the copy of the legal document sitting beside his father's coffee cup, because of course his father had a copy, because of course it had been reviewed and approved, and he held it for 1 moment and set it back down. "Call it off," he said. "Retract the document, pull the attorneys. Whatever Roland is operating under, end it." His father poured coffee. "Sit down." "I'm not sitting down. Call it off." Roland acted in the family's interest. Roland stood outside a pregnant woman's door at midnight and slid a legal threat underneath it. Quentin's voice was very quiet, the kind of quiet that went down instead of up. "That's not interest. That's cowardice dressed in legal language." Roland set his fork down. "The offer is substantial. She'd be financially." "Don't." Quentin turned to look at his brother fully. Something in his face made Roland stop. "Don't explain the math on my children to me." The word sat in the room. His father's eyes sharpened by a degree. "You've lost perspective," he said. "No, I found it." Quentin looked at him steadily. "I'm done. With the organization, with the operations, with the architecture you spent 30 years building. I'm done." The room went very still. Roland had stopped pretending to eat. Outside somewhere, a door opened and closed. One of the staff, the ordinary sound of a morning that had no idea what was happening in this room. "You don't walk away from this." His father said it with the settled certainty of a man who had never once been required to answer for anything. "You know what's attached to it." "I helped build half of it," Quentin said, "which means I know exactly how it comes apart. And if Roland contacts Delaney again, through attorneys, through anyone, in person, I will cooperate fully with the federal investigation that has been building a case against this organization for 3 years. And I have 3 years of documentation to make that cooperation worth their time." Roland stood up. "You're bluffing." "Try me." The silence was different now, not the silence of a room absorbing information. The silence of a room in which a threat had been made by someone the room understood was not bluffing, and everyone present was doing the rapid, private calculation of whether they had fundamentally misjudged this person. His father studied him, then quietly, "Get out of this house." Quinton picked up the document and folded it once. "The attorneys will have a retraction instruction by end of day." He looked at his father one more time, long enough for it to mean what it meant, and left without looking at Roland on his way out. Cyrus was at the car. "How bad?" "I threatened federal cooperation." "Did you mean it?" "Enough that they believed it." Quentin got in. "My father won't test it. He spent 30 years avoiding federal attention. He won't risk it on a personal matter." "Nicholas might." "Roland," Cyrus said carefully. "Roland does what my father permits." Quentin looked out the window as the Whitfield house disappeared behind the trees. "For now." Cyrus drove. After a moment, "There's one more thing. Wells wasn't just rerouting your communications. He had a secondary arrangement with Roland going back to May, before the dinner. Delaney's schedule, her routines, her medical appointments. He knew about the pregnancy at 9 weeks. The car felt smaller. "He knew there were children," Quentin said slowly, "and he still slid that document under her door." "Yes, He knew exactly what he was asking her to sign away. Quinton pressed the heel of his palm against his eye for a moment, a pressure, not a gesture, and then took his hand down and looked at the road ahead. "Call Imani," he said. "Tell her what we found. Tell her Roland had surveillance on Delaney since May, before the dinner, before any of it. Let Delaney decide if she wants to wait until tomorrow." Cyrus made the call on speaker. Imani answered on the second ring. He told her about Wells. He told her about May. He told her about the medical appointments. There was a silence on Imani's end that had texture, something almost audible, even in its absence. "Give me 20 minutes, Imani said. Then she wants to know if he's alone." "Just me and Cyrus." "Tell him to come." Delaney's blood pressure put her in the hospital 6 weeks later. Her OB had flagged a reading at 31 weeks, high but watchable. Delaney had watched it. At 33 weeks, the numbers stopped watching and started moving in the wrong direction, and Dr. Pelletier called at 7 in the morning and said the words that changed the shape of the next 24 hours. "I think we need to bring you in." Imani drove. Quinton met them at St. Joseph's. He sat in the waiting room with his hands flat on his knees and did not perform calm. He held it. Cyrus took the chairs near the door. Imani came out after 20 minutes. "Preeclampsia," she said. "Early stage but progressing. The OB wants her monitored. Early delivery is possible. Not today, but in the next few weeks depending on how she responds to treatment. The babies are strong. Both heartbeats are good." She paused. 33 weeks is manageable, but it's not full term." Quentin nodded once. "She's asking for you." Imani looked at him directly. "Don't make it more than it is. She's frightened. She's alone in there. She's asking because you're here. That's what it means and nothing else. But it means she's asking." He walked the long, pale hallway to her room. Delaney was on the monitoring bed, 2 sensors strapped to her abdomen, 2 heartbeats filling the small room, separate rhythms, layered, each one a small, insistent declaration of its own existence. She was looking at the ceiling when he pushed open the door. She turned her head. "Hey," she said. Her voice was tired. "Hey." He pulled the chair close and sat down. He did not reach for her hand. "They sound strong," he said, looking at the monitor. "Yeah," she kept her eyes on it. "Dr. Pelletier says the babies are fine. It's my blood pressure that's the issue." "You're not the issue." "Medically, I am." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, not quite not. The cuff on her arm inflated and released. The number on the monitor held steady, not where it needed to be, but steady. "Delaney," he started. "Don't," she said. "Not right now." "Okay." She looked at the ceiling again. "Just stay." "Okay," he said. And he stayed. He sat in that chair while the monitors tracked 2 heartbeats, and the institutional light did its inadequate best. And outside the window, Chicago went on the way cities went on, indifferent to whatever was happening inside any given room. He sat and said nothing. And after a long time, Delaney's hand moved from her stomach and came to rest on the arm of his chair, not on his hand, not quite touching him, just close enough that he could feel the warmth of it. She closed her eyes. The numbers on the monitor came down slowly over the following 2 hours, not to where they needed to be, but moving. "Tell me something," she said eventually, without opening her eyes. "Anything. I do better when there's noise." Quinton sat forward slightly. He thought for a moment. Then he told her about the mug, about standing in her kitchen in October, watching her make espresso with the full attention she brought to everything, and saying something careless about paper cups, about driving to the Whitfield house 4 days after the dinner and standing in the foyer for a full minute before he unwrapped it, about putting it on his kitchen counter and being unable to move it anywhere else for 3 weeks. "I made that in a pottery class," she said. "It was the only thing I ever finished." "I know. You told me once you had a sketchbook full of half-drawn things." "I told you that?" October 14th, walking along the lake. "You said you were bad at finishing things that didn't have a deadline attached." Delaney was quiet for a moment. The monitor beeped, the cuff released. "Stop remembering things," she said, not unkindly. Okay. The numbers came down 2 more points. Dr. Pelletier came in at 9 with the overnight chart and said, I want to admit you. 2 to 3 days, minimum. We'll see what the next 12 hours show. Okay, Delaney said, admit me. When the doctor left, Delaney looked at the ceiling for a long moment. I need to call my mother, she said. She lives in Phoenix. She moved down 4 years ago, and I kept thinking I'd tell her when things were more settled. She paused. She's going to want to know who the father is. Quinton said nothing. I'm not trying to make that pointed, Delaney said. I'm just narrating. I do that when I'm nervous. I know. You did it the first time we had dinner. You described the restaurant to yourself out loud while you were reading the menu. You said, okay, this place is the kind of place where the bread basket arrives before anyone orders it, and someone in the kitchen has a strong opinion about fennel. Delaney stared at him. August 19th, he said, a Thursday. She looked at the window. Her jaw moved slightly, not setting, not the precursor to tears, something in between. You remembered the date, she said. I had a lot of time to remember things. The cuff inflated again, released. The number was lower. Tell me what else you remember, Delaney said quietly, looking at the courtyard through the window, the particular gold of late autumn coming through institutional glass. So he told her August 19th and the bread basket and the fennel. He told her the night in October when she'd come to his apartment and found him on the kitchen floor trying to fix a leaking pipe because he'd wanted for once to fix something without calling someone else to do it. And she'd taken the wrench without comment and done it in 3 minutes flat because her mother had taught her plumbing, the same way Quentin's father had taught him leverage, by example. He told her the card she'd almost written for the ceramic mug before she'd decided against a card entirely, because she'd mentioned once that she rewrote things until they were honest, and had gone through 4 drafts of a birthday card for Amani the previous year. Delaney listened with her eyes on the window and her hand resting on her stomach, the monitors keeping their steady background rhythm. When he stopped, she was quiet for a moment. I almost wrote something for the mug, she said. I went through 3 versions. The last one said, for the man who makes ordinary mornings feel like something worth showing up for. She paused. I decided it was too much. I would have kept it. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes went wet, not spilling over, just present. Stop, she said. Her voice was soft, not unkind, just close to the edge of something. Okay. The afternoon light shifted. A nurse came in, checked the monitors, adjusted the IV line, left without speaking. On the next reading, Delaney's blood pressure was down 3 more points. Better, she said, looking at the number. Better, he agreed. Everly and Thomas arrived at 35 weeks, 3 days, on a cold Thursday morning in February. It was not the emergency Delaney had feared through those last 6 weeks of careful monitoring and twice-weekly appointments, and the specific particular vigilance of a woman who understood exactly what was at stake. The blood pressure had held. The twins had grown into a size that made the NICU team say, with the measured optimism of people who had learned not to promise better than expected. Delaney called Imani first, then Quinton, in that order, which was the order that was right and which Quinton had never once questioned. He was at St. Joseph's in 20 minutes. He stayed for 11 hours. He didn't talk too much. He gave her ice chips when the nurse suggested it and backed off when she said she was done with ice chips. Enough with the ice chips, and returned to simply being present, which he had learned slowly and with Delaney's assistance was a skill that required its own kind of practice. He watched her do the work of it, the real grinding, physical and psychological work, the kind that left nothing withheld and nothing performed. It was the most honest thing he had ever seen a person do, and he watched all of it. Everly came first. 5 pounds, 2 ounces, crying immediately. He heard her, and something in his chest that had been braced against impact since September released the way a structure releases scaffolding when the building finally stands on its own. Thomas came 9 minutes later. Quiet at first, just for a few seconds, long enough for everyone in the room to stop breathing. then a small, furious sound. The collective exhale was audible. They were taken to the NICU. Standard for 35 weeks, the team moving with the ease of people who had done this 1,000 times before. Delaney lay back against the pillow and closed her eyes and was quiet for a long time. Quinton sat beside her. He was still holding her hand from when she'd needed it held, and she hadn't asked him to let go. "They're here," she said. "They're here. They're okay. They're okay." She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling and exhaled the full-body kind, the kind that moved through her shoulders and her chest and seemed to last longer than one breath had any right to. She turned her head and looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at things she had been reading carefully, fully, keeping score. She'd told him that once. "I've been keeping score." "The score is good," she said, "in case you were wondering." He looked at her and didn't say anything, because there wasn't a sentence adequate to the moment, and he had been learning, slowly and with Delaney's specific and patient help, that the absence of a sentence was sometimes the more honest response. "I meant what I said at the restaurant," she told him. "This starts from here, from what we actually know about each other, from what the last 5 months actually cost, not from before. I know. But I think," she stopped. Her eyes went wet, the real kind, not the passing weather kind, and she let it be that without apologizing for it. "I think we're something," she said. "I'd like to try, if you would." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to the back of it. Not a kiss exactly, a placement. The closest physical equivalent he had to something that didn't have a name. "Yes," he said. The Whitfield organization's formal dissolution took 6 weeks. Quentin's attorneys worked from a neutral office downtown, not the family building. The legitimate businesses, the investment firm, the real estate holdings, were cleanly separable because he had always quietly made sure they were. The rest required different handling. The kind of reckoning that Quentin had known was coming for 12 years and had been choosing, one day at a time, not to look at directly. His father stood down, not gracefully, not quietly, but he stood down. He had spent 30 years making rational calculations about risk, and the calculation he made now was that Quentin's departure was a loss he could absorb more readily than the alternative. Roland came to the conference room once, on a Tuesday afternoon, without an appointment. He sat across from Quinton and looked at the table covered in documents and said, "You're actually doing this?" "Yes." "For her." "For them," Quinton said. "There's a difference." Roland was quiet. He looked at the documents. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite guilt, too measured for that, but was something adjacent to it. The expression of a person who has been operating inside a framework that made complete sense until the framework itself became visible. "I thought about her as a variable," Roland said. "I understand that's not." "Their names are Everly and Thomas," Quinton said. Roland's jaw tightened. He looked at the table. "They came home from the NICU last week." Quinton let that sit for a moment, both of them. Roland's eyes went somewhere he didn't immediately return from. "I'm sorry," he said. And this time it didn't sound calibrated. It sounded like a person trying to find the bottom of something he'd done and discovering it was deeper than he'd calculated for. "I know," Quinton said. "We'll figure out what that means over time. Not today." Roland nodded once. He stood, looked at his brother once more at the door, a look complicated in a way their interactions had never been before, because complicated required a certain amount of honesty, and left. Quinton sat in the conference room with the documents and the particular quiet of a room where something real had just happened. After a moment, he picked up his phone and called Delaney. "How are you feeling?" he said when she answered. "Like I'm housing 2 people who have very strong opinions about my ribs." She paused. "How was the meeting?" "Roland came." "I figured. You only call right after, when you're still processing something." He sat with that for a moment. The fact that she knew that. The fact that 2 months of Thursday dinners and NICU waiting rooms and late-night soup and the particular rhythm of 2 people carefully learning each other, had produced a person who could read that specific register in his voice. He apologized, Quinton said. Do you believe him? I believe he's somewhere in the beginning of understanding what he did. Whether that becomes something real, time, she said. Time, he agreed. Come for dinner, she said. I made too much again. He came. The ceramic mug sat on Delaney's kitchen counter through February and March and into April. The blue one, uneven at the base, the glaze deeper than she'd planned. Quinton had retrieved it from the Whitfield house and brought it to her apartment, and she'd put it on the counter and used it every morning without comment, which was, he had learned, Delaney's way of saying something that didn't require words. On a morning in late April, she was making espresso when Everly made a sound from the bassinet in the next room, and Thomas answered it. Small, exploratory. The two of them, already in some private conversation, she was only beginning to learn the language of. Quinton came in from the hallway, barefoot, hair still flattened on one side, having been up since 5 the way he always was. He looked at the bassinet, then at her. They're talking again, he said. They're always talking. I just don't know what about yet. He poured coffee into the mug. He stood at the counter and looked out the window at Chicago, doing its early April thing. Pale, cold, the lake somewhere beyond the buildings, present the way it always was whether you were looking at it or not. Delaney watched him for a moment. The man who had said the most devastating thing she'd ever heard said about herself. The man who had sat in a hospital chair for 11 hours because she'd had something close to frightened in her eyes. The man who had walked away from an empire and was standing barefoot in her kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, learning the language of 2 people, small enough to fit in the crook of his arm. People were not their worst sentences. She had believed that when she said it to children who were still learning the difference between what they'd done and who they were. She wasn't always sure she believed it about adults. She believed it about this one. She'd known it since February. She'd just needed time to stop being afraid of knowing it. Come here, she said. He turned from the window. She handed him Everly. He took her with the ease of someone who had practiced, one hand under the head, the baby's weight along his forearm, and he looked down at his daughter with the expression that had been the same since the first time, unguarded, unperformed. The look of a man who had spent his entire adult life being who the situation required him to be, and was finally, tentatively, beginning to find out who he actually was underneath it. Hey, he said to her, low and quiet, just that. Thomas made a sound from the bassinet. That's your brother, registering his opinion, Delaney told Everly. He always has one, Quentin said, still looking at his daughter, even at 3 in the morning. Especially at 3 in the morning. The morning came in through the kitchen window, pale and April cold, the lake light filtering through the buildings the way it did in this city, diffuse and omnipresent. And Delaney stood in the kitchen she'd built, in the life she'd built, the café downstairs, the apartment above it, the second-hand bookshelf she'd arranged by color because it made her happy, the chalkboard on the wall where Amani had written the twins' names. The morning they came home, and neither of them had erased it, and she watched a man hold her daughter in the light of an ordinary Thursday morning. The worst sentence she'd ever heard about herself had not been the last word. It had just been the beginning of finding out what the real one was.